So this introductory talk is about the research scaffold. And this talk, I've given it a number of times, and it changes every time. But the term scaffold was one which was introduced to us in Barcelona when I gave a version of this talk, and as a public lecture. And John Toomey of O'Donnell Toomey was in the audience. He was examining for us. And he came up to me afterwards and he said, what you're talking about is the scaffold. And it's the first time that we'd thought of using that term. And basically, I really like it because what we're saying in all of this is these are the things that we've learnt over the years to be useful in doing this process. They may or may not be useful to you, so they're a scaffold. You can erect any part of it or dismantle any part of it. It's not a formula or anything like that. It's really just a kind of record of where we came from. So as you know, this investigation has been going on since the late 1980s, and the first people to graduate from it were in 1991. And the fundamental aim of it has been to invite people with a notable practice to look back over what they've achieved and understand the nature of that achievement a bit more clearly than they can in the hurly-burly of actually achieving, and then also to look forward towards the future. So I happen to be up in the Red Centre and in a hire car, and I could see Uluru in the distance. I could see Katajuta behind me. And it seemed to me that this kind of symbolized what we're doing. We're looking at a destination somewhere in the future. Mind you, I did read this weekend that Hilaire Belloc said time is the best teacher. Unfortunately, she kills her pupils. So anyway, so we're looking at, and this process of looking back, looking forward, and also being situated where you are is exactly what we're aiming at in this program. Looking back, looking here, looking forward. Now, let me see if I can go in the right way. Yeah. So we've there's quite a history to this. On the 25th anniversary of it, we produced the Pink Book, and that gives an account of how the program developed. It also lists most of the people who've been through it up until that point. And there are interviews with various people who have been through the process. And so that's quite a useful document. And you can get that from Blurb online. And the cover of this one shows Graham Christ completing his PhD. And because I've shown this to people who don't know what we're doing at all, but here's just a quick flash through of people who've been through the process. Sean Godsall, a very interesting Luk Boonji in Singapore, whose practice dramatically changed after going through this process. Richard Hassel of Woha, Jo van den Berg, Belgium, Arno Hendricks, Belgium, Deborah Sant, just recently completed, and C.J. Lim, and James McAdam, and Tanya Kalinana, who has just last night posted on Facebook a letter from RMIT telling her that she may apply to graduate as a doctor. And Tom Holbrook in 2014. And then this ideogram goes back right to the origins of this whole approach. And what is distinctive about it is a determination to do research which is not about architecture, but is in the medium of architecture itself. Now, there's plenty of very distinguished research about architecture. When I say plenty, there has been, and there's been some very good sociological analysis of architectural practice, but it all took place in the 1980s. There's been nothing since. It'd be really nice if there was something more recent. So it's not that this way of researching is in any sense belittling a sociological or an economical or an environmental science slant on research, but it is one that for the first time really looks at what it is that people do when they design and in the process of designing. So this was a very important part of it. And the other part of this is not establishing mastery, but surfacing evidence about mastery. So we do have another stream that runs parallel through the PRS where there are much younger people who haven't yet got a practice who are in a way using this process to begin a practice. But in what we're looking at here is this business of surfacing evidence about the nature of architectural mastery. So in the pink book, there is one summary ideogram, and I'm just going to take you through that. Oh, it's that one. And the whole stage on which this takes place, you can imagine this is a series of theatres. It is a stage which is about looking at what we do through the medium of what we do. And I know when I say the medium of design, I'm as aware as the rest of you are that you don't spend all day, every day, designing, but there are all sorts of things that surround the process of designing which also come into play. Then there's a large part of what we look at which has been captured through understanding the natural history of creative innovators, whatever field they're in. It doesn't really matter what field, and there's as I discovered, a bit of a way into what we were doing, looking around for validating research that Howard Gardner has spent now 30 years himself with master's students at Harvard studying the natural history of creative individuals in all sorts of fields. I'm going to go into that in a bit. Then I'm really interested in the spatial intelligence that we use in designing and the kinds of mental space that every designer builds in order to design. The scholarship cone was a way in which we have very often conceptualized this process of going to PRSs. You arrive at a PRS with a practice, which is the base of the cone, and you present the scope of that practice and your initial propositions about it, and that's what confirmation of candidature is about. But then you come typically 3 times again, looking back at the nature of the practice that you've already established and looking at what's happening to the practice as you understand more about where you've come from, and then beginning to speculate about where you will go next. So we'll look at this a bit later, but the scholarship cone at the top of it, where it's coloured in, there's the notion of a PhD moment, and that's the moment where you look back at it and you go, I think I can see a way of finishing this investigation. And one of our mentors and critics, Gerard Dezieux, has pointed out through his many decades of working in the area of PhDs that a PhD isn't actually research as such. A PhD is something you extract from your research. And that works very well for us because our argument is that the research is going on in the practice all the time. And a PhD is a thing that has a certain form. And I sometimes talk to my candidates about it being like a sonnet. I mean, it's got rhyming couplets and it's that long. And you have to, eventually you have to extract something from everything you're doing which fits that process. Of course, we're much more elaborate in the kinds of shape of PhD that we're interested in, because we then start saying, well, what's the kind of shape that fits your investigation? In the fifth part of this is the scholarship, is after the scholarship cone, which is also now expressed in this way in the book, where you've got the face looking back, the face looking at what's going on at the moment, and the face looking forward. and quite often use that, and I'll show you how we've developed that a little later. The fifth part of this is the enchainment structure, and part of that is we've always been trying to understand who amongst your peers, your mentors, and your challengers matter to you. They sit around you and they shape the territory that you occupy. They, in a sense, you ride the boundary between your position and their positions. And articulating that has become something which seems quite an important way of doing what in a traditional PhD would be the literature review. And those peers are not necessarily only the people who sit close to you, they're also the people around the world who bother you in some way or another. We also there, after some time of doing that, discovered that Randall Collins at Harvard, a sociologist, had spent his career studying the conditions which give rise to intellectual change. And he showed how throughout history, and in the very first empirical study into how intellectual change takes place, that it happens most fruitfully when there are three very strong positions being argued for in a field. And he says that when there's one, almost invariably there's some kind of political domination going on, and it's static, and until it collapses, very little happens. If there are two, it's adversarial, and again, it tends to be locked in place. It's just them and us, and black and white, and left and right. And curiously enough, that's where Hegel and all those duality models sit, and they're not based on any kind of empirical research. It's a kind of template forced, an intellectual template forced on things. But Randall Collins has showed that every time something really fruitful develops in thinking, it's because there are three positions, and there's a spiral of regard which goes between them. So, and he also says, as I've said to you many times, that it's never more than three, because as soon as it gets to four, it splits again into two camps. And also, he says rather nicely, he thinks that to be able to defend yourself in the terms of two other arguments is all that can be humanly expected of an individual. Anyway, so, in six, lurking behind this is the idea of the by publication PhD, and except that here we're saying that your projects are the publications, and that you're here, and I think that's true of everybody here. Sometimes there are people from the other stream here, but everybody here's. Your projects are what we like to consider as the publications. They're things that they have themselves been published, they've been subject to peer review, they've been awarded, or they've been in exhibitions, that sort of thing. So part of what happens is you're invited because you've got those publications there already, and you can look back over them. You, as in a PhD by publication, look back over them and try and articulate how you got to the position where you had these projects, but then you look back at the critiques that you've had over the years and whether they've assisted in that process. And you work your way towards an overarching description of what the practice is, but with, in our case, a strong emphasis on trying to understand what comes next. So that's a kind of summary ideogram. So in the medium of design, I've told you about the natural history of innovators. I've forgotten I'd done this clever trick. Anyway, spatial intelligence and mental space. Scholarship cone model, enchainment, and so on. Then in the center of this is this very firm acknowledgement that we're none of us at work in this alone. We're all standing on on the shoulders of others. And I think Pia's going to talk quite a bit about that after me. And in a way, understanding that is what we would describe, as I said earlier, in the traditional PhD as a literature review. So how do we do this? And the way in which we've been looking at it over the years is summarized in this cube. Let me see if I've been clever with this one as well. Yes. So one side of it's really a slice of cheese. As I showed this to Grafton architects in Dublin, and they said, "Your cube isn't a cube." And I thought, well, no, it's not. Or maybe it's a slice of cheese. Anyway, the one side of it is the natural history of the creative practitioner. And what I found uncanny when I first discovered this work by Howard Gardner was how it fitted what, for the past 10 years, we had been finding with the people going through the early stages of this program. So a creative practitioner tends to come from a province. Now, that sounds a startling thing to say, but in fact, I think everyone comes from a province, even if they come from London. They come from a part of London. And, so even in a world city, you actually exist in a provincial situation, but you're aware of a metropolitan situation. And I think these days the metropolis is really something that you find on the internet. It's not a city somewhere else. You find peers who are interested in what you are interested in. And for us, that tends to be going to university. You explore your chosen terrain. And during that time, you tend to pick an abiding interest. There's something that you find that you feel you've got your fingers to that nobody else has quite touched before. And that leads to quite often a period of isolation where you think you know what it is that you've found, but you can't really say what it is. And so in that period of isolation, there's a lot of working out what it is. But you crave recognition. And I usually talk about the famous story about Carl Jung and that tower he built himself on the banks of the lake, and where he sat and worked on his archetypes. And he'd work all year, and then his friend Wilhelm Reich would come back from China, where he was working on the I Ching, and the two of them would walk around the lake, and both saying to the other, "And then I thought this, what do you think? And I thought that, and what do you think about this?" And so they would try and expose to each other everything, and after a few circumambulations of the lake, they could both carry on for another year. But you do need to be able to say to somebody, "Can you see what it is I'm doing?" And I think it's really crucial that you identify who it is that you need to talk to about that, who you seek your recognition from. It's another facet, in a way, of the whole community of practice that we talk about, but I think a really crucial one. And I think also that it's something that sometimes, when I first came across this, I thought, oh God, I wish I'd thought about this years ago, because I would have then set up a recognition structure which would have helped me get where I was going a lot faster, possibly. Then we move on to another face of this cube. And this is the public behaviors, and that's a term from Randall Collins's great book. And all the references are available in Mastering Architecture, but where you can find them. But public behaviors, he says that we are enchained, but we're enchained within a field, and every field has its public behaviors, and you have to engage with those public behaviors even as you criticize them, or you have to know the rules to break the rules. And I give an example a little bit later on of how that happens in mathematics. So being conscious of what the public behaviors are that you're engaged in is quite crucial. And I think we don't realize the extent to which we immerse ourselves in public behavior, which is a construct. It's something that's been created. And when Aurelio Galfetti was here, we were having a conversation about what architecture schools do. And he basically said what they do is put students in the position of being an architect. So we actually literally put them there. Some of us have grown up in architectural families, so we're probably doomed from an early stage. But anyway, so understanding what seem invisible to us usually, the public behaviors, because we take them as givens, and we then cause our students to take them as givens as well. And in a way, understanding them so you can use them rather than be victims of them. And then you have to engage in the public order of a domain, but maintain your marginality. Engage in the public order. He gives he's talking, a lot of his research is in the area of philosophy, the whole history of philosophy, East and West. And he says in philosophy, you can never say, that's rubbish. You have to say, I have a problem with that proposition. And if you burst out and say, that's rubbish, you're thrown out. And clearly I'm not a philosopher anyway. But maintain marginality. And this is a very interesting thing. So it's as if you come in and debate, but you go back to where you can look at things from the side. And chained in small groups governed by the law of small numbers, which I described a moment ago, and divided by substantive argument. This is not simply semantic argument. These are different positions. I'll show you how we look at that through the process of differentiation in a moment. Thrive on competition and motivated by idea and not by gain is a fairly common thing in this process. Then the top of this is actually quite crucial. And this is a concept that we've used in the school for many years, and it comes from the research of Ernst Boyart and his teams of researchers funded by the Carnegie Foundation. Again, it's the only substantial body of empirical research into what actually happens in universities, which normally divide their activity between research and teaching. And he says that this is a complete nonsense. And what they find is that there are 4 kinds of scholarship active in universities. And there's a scholarship of discovery in which you unearth new knowledge. There's a scholarship of integration where you integrate new knowledge to existing knowledge. And there's a scholarship of application where you work out how to use knowledge. And there's a scholarship of dissemination, which is where you work out how to communicate it. And that includes devising learning environments. Now, that is true of practice as well. I mean, in a practice, all of those things are going on. So in the early days of this, used to talk to people who would think that they had to leave their practice in order to do research. And that's still a fairly common notion. But it's not. There's some of this going on in every aspect of practice, in every aspect of what we do at a university. So it's a crucial idea that breaks down the barriers between what you might think of as research and what you might consider as practice. And then typically there's 7 years of activity, 7 to 10 years of activity before you have a body of work which is substantial enough to engage in this kind of examining of things. And then there's the business of, in your first presentation, making the case about your practice and the propositions. And I try and make my candidates do their confirmation in their first PRS. And then looking at the backstory in more detail to examine and work out whether those propositions are effective or not, and then slowly moving through this process. And these are just a series of diagrams constructed while working with a candidate and looking at what it is that they're going to present in each PRS, when the focus is in that direction, when the focus begins to be on what's happening in the practice when the focus looks forward, and then coming to the point where you can actually create what I used to call a research catalogue, because I think that's what we're actually doing, but it's this catalogue in the sense that G2 monographs are catalogues in which there's a set, the works are properly documented, there are critical essays about them, there is the overarching essay describing the whole process. And then with Richard Blythe and Marcello beginning to look more closely at these processes, they articulated, and this was published in that book, they articulated the way in which we reflect, saying there's a beginning with a reflecting on the work, looking at what's already been done, then there's a reflecting in the work that's going on, and there's a reflecting for future projects. And Richard, as a practitioner, argues that each time you do these kinds of reflection, the way in which you view the history of the practice changes. And you reorganize it and marshal it. And he thinks that that is well worth documenting. Obviously, my fascination with all of this is driven by the notion of spatial intelligence. And I believe that that is the fundamental basis of the knowledge that creates a discipline. It's a discipline which, unlike any other, uses spatial thinking. And so we look for ways of uncovering the mental space that a practice creates in order to do what it does, and to look at the way in which it creates its own sustaining public behaviors in order to continue as a practice. This book came out just as we started to, as we ended the master's era of this research and began the PhD stuff, but the principles are exactly the same. And this book was used as the basis of the second ever research seminar organized by the RIBA in London. But it summarizes much of what I've been talking to. It talks about the groups in mastering and how we engage in a public order and all that stuff that I've just been talking to you about. And it talks about the tripolarity, which, of course, in architecture has a history going back 2,000 years. And it's been well articulated. And in the 1642 translation into English, between firmness, commodity, and delight. And in a way, looking, as I did with an exhibition at Tarawara some years ago, looking around what was currently going on in Melbourne and grouping people whose main focus, although everybody, of course, aims to be involved in all of those things, the main focus was in one of these areas and clustered their projects in a virtual city on a tiered table in the middle of the room, which went through these kinds of emphases. So it's looking at, in your own area of practice, where do you sit relative to your admired peers? And this exhibition and the book came out at about the same time, was at Tarawara it's now 10 years ago. Why is that? What have I done? Okay. So there was a cluster that I put in around civic narrative expression, and that is the kind of engagement with social use, with commodity, and Lyons Architects. In the middle, there was Shane Murray with his work then, McBride, Charles Ryan with their work in McDougall, and Peter Corrigan, all in a sense in that cluster. There was a group who were mainly interested in firmness, and there's some surprises in this. in the sense that Tom Kovac and Sean Godsall sit together, and Ivan Rejovic and Kirsten Thompson were all, in my view at that time, in that kind of pursuit of a kind of purity. And then the ones who, in a misuse of the term poetics really, because every one of these has its poetic, the ones who focused entirely on delight perhaps. And there was a cluster of Denton Corker Marshall projects which do that, not all of them. And then the Woodmarsh, the Peter Elliott, John Wardle, and Alan Power group. So that was an analysis at that time. And what's interesting to me with my candidates is for them to actually be able to flesh out where they sit relative to their peers, not necessarily in their own city. And then we went through this a bit earlier, the individual and mastery, and the way in which we've begun to understand all of this in a somewhat more nuanced and subtle way, which is evidenced in this book, and began to see that the tripolarity takes place in a series of cascading fans. There's your political position, there's your preferred mode of practice, your manner of practice, there's the firmness, commodity, and delight thing, and then there are the default methods of designing. And you can read about this, but this process of differentiation makes the whole business of understanding your own position quite clear. And you can use this and the more structured version of it in this book just as a checklist, and probably come up with your own kinds of fans. So that's this book, and the book contains a couple of essays explaining this and the history of every part of this. Every fan has a bibliography of its own, but it also contains the 10-page digests of PhDs by Benedict Anderson, Susie Atterwell, Nigel Bertram, Richard Black, Stephen Collier, Graham Christ, Harold Fallon, Honor Hendricks, Paul Menifee, Vivian Mitsogiani, Stephen Neal, John Terry, Jo van den Berg, and Gretchen Wilkins. So it's part of a long history. We publish all through the history of this program. We capture those, and we're about to do the next volume of that, capturing another group of PhDs. Just a quick example, which is in the book, about using that scaffold to understand something, and just using this little building by Paul Morgan, spending some hours going through it with him and shading in the parts of the differentiation fans that were relevant in the process of designing that, and being able to show what parts of his mental space were active in it. In the book, Mastering Architecture, there's a bit about what thwarts mastery. That comes almost directly from Randall Collins. There's encouraging mastery and innovation, and this is something that almost every successful practice finds a way of doing, building virtuous circles and finding ways of engaging in exhibition culture, finding clients who are interested in procuring innovation, using the concept of integrated scholarship and doing research into what you're actually doing rather than simply self-promoting. And the whole aim at that stage was to become a self-curator as a portal from mastery to another stage in creative innovation. I put that in here just because the RMIT is not the only place which has sought to procure innovative architecture, and this book, while it documents likely what we've tried to do at RMIT, also looks at what numerous other organizations around the world have done. And one of the interesting things about the Pink Book and the interviews in it is how some people say that having been through this process, they've been much more aware of what kind of clients they should go looking for. And also talk about understanding the curatorial processes that are inherent in a city, and the way in which in Melbourne there's this kind of early stage where innovative work in a practice takes place on the periphery of the city, and you end up doing things related to the civic spine. And then that's part of understanding your province, but at the same time, part of that is defining your metropolis. And as I said earlier, I see that as a way of trying to actually pin down what are the most useful conversations you have. And as I said too, they might very well be with people on other continents. I've just completed this book, which flows out of this, and that we're launching on Friday. And the argument here is that architects study briefs and sites and all the rest of it, and until they establish a poetic which satisfies them, and then from that designing cascades. And there are 22 case studies showing how that happens. And I look at that in 4 tranches: that Making Home, with stuff by Richard Blythe, DRMM, Housebrand, Fairy Heron, and MVS, and then Feeding Body, Mind and Soul with Bakker, Vandenberg, Hogg and Reed get in there twice because they did two very different buildings. Kurt Togp in Iceland, Sean Godsall, Crab Studio in London, and in brackets, every one of them has been given a companion building, which in a way just sits there as a teaser. These are buildings that seem to occupy the same kind of, seem to be based on the same kind of poetic. And then Healing the City, Kirsten Thompson, CZGW, O'Donnell Toomey, and DSDHA, that's Deborah Saun's practice, and O'Donnell Toomey, and Toomey and Lyons. And then M3 are in there, Capturing Nature, W Architects, Kirsten Green, Woha, and Yoshida Finley. This is my summary diagram, which has been printed as a guide to the exhibition, which will be opening after the exams on Thursday, Friday. And you see, I've constructed a bridge, and the footings are firmly embedded on spatial intelligence and understanding your spatial intelligence and the way in which you've developed it, your spatial thinking. Sitting on top of that is my wedge of cheese with its X, Y, and Z face. From that, you construct recognition arches, and on top of that, the practice sits. So you've got your natural history, you've got your tripolar enchainment, and you've got your integrated scholarship. And that's a kind of summary of where we're at. And I can never resist this. When everybody thought that Story Hall was very much finished, and then suddenly we came up with another extrusion of it. And so is this the end? No, it's only a beginning. It's a scaffold. And I love that poem by Wozniacki, who was studying architecture and in Moscow. And there was a fire in the architecture department. And the lines go, "They've gone up in flames, all those cowsheds decorated in Rococo." And he's lost his portfolio. And it's the end of his architectural education. And he says, "Is it the end?" No, it's only a beginning. Anyway, that's my presentation.